In the scorching heat of the desert city, I found myself kneeling, gripping an old Bible tightly in my hands. The weight of its worn leather felt strange to me, like it was both foreign and familiar at the same time. My father, a powerful imam, stood before me, his face twisted in fury. His eyes, usually so full of command and reverence, now burned with disdain. His voice shook with anger as he called me a traitor, a disgrace to our family and faith. The weight of his words crashed down on me, but in that moment, I didn't feel the fear I expected. Instead, there was a strange, unshakable peace settling deep within me. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and for the first time, I truly understood what it meant to be free. I knew then that this was not the end. It was only the beginning of a journey that would cost me everything I had ever known, everything I had ever been. I would lose my family, my name, and everything that had defined me. But I would gain something far greater than I could ever have imagined. I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and though I stood on the edge of a precipice, I felt no fear. Only a quiet certainty that I was finally on the path I was always meant to walk. This is where my story begins, and it's a story I must share. My name is Rashid. I was born in a small town in southern Iran, where faith was not just a part of life, it was the very foundation of it. My father, Imam Jabbar, was a man of strong character, revered in our community. He was a pillar of our faith, and his presence commanded respect. From the moment I could walk, he began teaching me everything he knew about the Quran and Islam, expecting nothing less than perfection from me. I memorized the verses, followed the rules, and performed my prayers with devotion, as he taught me. In our home, everything was structured, and every action was guided by the principles of Islam. Every word I spoke had to be filled with respect for our religion, every decision weighed by its alignment with faith. Growing up, I believed that this strict adherence to our beliefs was the only way to live. I was taught that Islam was not just a religion but a way of life, and that to stray from its teachings was to abandon the truth. My father would often tell me that I was chosen to carry the torch of our family's faith, to uphold the honor of our name, and to stand as a beacon of righteousness in a world filled with temptation. There was no room for questioning. It was a life of discipline and duty. But everything changed the day I met Ferris. He was unlike anyone I had ever encountered. He had a kind of light in his eyes, a calmness that seemed to radiate from him, even in the midst of the harsh realities of the world around us. Unlike me, he did not pray 5 times a day or follow the strict routines I had been taught to adhere to. He didn't fast during Ramadan, and he didn't follow the rules the way I had been taught to. Yet he spoke about love, peace, and forgiveness, concepts that I had never truly understood in the rigid structure of my upbringing. His words were unlike anything I had ever heard in the mosque or from my father. He talked about a kind of love that was not earned, a peace that wasn't dictated by rules or rituals. For the first time, I questioned everything I had been taught. His words haunted me. How could someone live without following the rules, without devotion to the faith as I had been raised to? He seemed so sure of himself, so confident in his beliefs. His certainty struck me like a thunderclap. And then, one day, he said something that I could never forget. Faith is not a chain. It is freedom. Those words lingered in my mind for days, like a seed planted deep within my heart, one that I couldn't ignore. I had been taught that faith was a responsibility, a burden even, that weighed on my shoulders like a heavy stone. But Ferris spoke of it as if it were something liberating, something that freed him from the constraints I'd always lived with. I didn't understand how this could be. I couldn't reconcile the idea of faith as freedom with everything I had learned. For so many years, I had believed that true devotion required sacrifice, struggle, and obedience to the rules. But Ferris was living proof that faith could be something different, something more. As the days passed, I found myself thinking more and more about what he had said. I began to question everything I had known. Was there more to life than just following rules? Could faith really be about love, peace, and freedom, rather than punishment and fear? I couldn't stop thinking about it, even when I was praying, even when I was reciting the Quran. Something deep inside me was stirring, but I was too afraid to admit it. I had been taught that questioning my faith was the ultimate betrayal, that doubt was the enemy of righteousness. But how could I ignore the truth that was being uncovered in my heart? It was then that I began to realize that the world I'd lived in, one of rigid rules, constant discipline, and unquestioning obedience, was no longer enough for me. I had seen a glimpse of something greater, something that promised freedom and peace, and I couldn't just turn my back on it. But I didn't know how to take the first step. I was trapped in a web of expectations, both from my father and from myself. The weight of tradition was heavy on my shoulders, and the fear of disappointing my family, of dishonoring my father, made it almost impossible to imagine a different path. Yet, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, I couldn't shake the feeling that Ferris had shown me something that I had to follow. And so, I found myself standing at a crossroads, caught between the life I had always known and the possibility of something radically different. The path of devotion and obedience, or the path of love and freedom. Each step I took in one direction would bring me further from everything I had been raised to believe, and closer to the unknown. The conflict inside me was unbearable, yet I knew I had to face it. The life I had been living was no longer enough. Something inside me was calling for more. After meeting Ferris, my mind began to pull me toward a precipice I had never imagined. The questions I started asking myself were ones I had never dared to entertain before. What if my life wasn't meant to be one of endless service, one bound by duty and obedience? What if there was something more beyond the life I had been taught to follow since the moment I was born? The realization hit me like a quiet storm, unsettling and powerful. These questions, once forbidden, began to gnaw at me, pushing aside the certainty I had once held so tightly. I spent more time walking alone, finding solace in the quiet spaces of my life. The garden behind our house became my refuge, a place where I could escape the suffocating weight of my responsibilities. There, away from the eyes of my family and the expectations of my father, I could finally hear my own thoughts. The stillness of the garden was my only companion, and it allowed me to reflect on the words Ferris had shared with me. I often found myself repeating them in my mind. You don't have to live in fear. Those words were a soft whisper, a reminder that there could be more to life than the constant vigilance I had been taught to maintain. One evening, as I sat there in the cool air, my hands trembling slightly, I looked up at the sky. The stars above me seemed so distant, so infinite, yet their light reached me in that moment, as though they were trying to communicate something beyond the darkness of the night. I felt small, but not in the way I used to. I didn't feel insignificant. Instead, I felt like I was on the verge of something much greater. Something was changing inside me, shifting in ways I couldn't explain. It was as if a new understanding was taking root in my heart, one that went against everything I had been taught. But the fear was still there, lurking in the corners of my mind, and it was powerful. The fear of my father's disappointment, the fear of my family's judgment, and the fear of losing everything I had known. These were not just abstract fears. They were real, tangible threats that had shaped my every decision up until that point. My father's strict expectations weighed on me, as did the knowledge that to stray from the path I had been set on would mean not just disobedience, but betrayal. The community I had been part of, the very people who had watched me grow up, would turn their backs on me. That thought alone was enough to send waves of anxiety through me. Despite the clarity I was beginning to see, Despite the whisper of freedom that seemed to call to me, the weight of tradition and fear was almost unbearable. It wasn't just about my father's anger. It was about the shame that would come with stepping away from the life that had been laid out for me. The thought of breaking those bonds, of choosing a path that would alienate me from everything I knew, was terrifying. I was torn between the person I was beginning to understand I could be and the person everyone expected me to be. In those quiet moments, when I sat in the garden alone, the internal conflict became almost overwhelming. I wanted to embrace this new understanding, this new way of thinking, but I was paralyzed by the fear of what that would mean for my family and my place in the world. The night sky, so full of possibility, seemed to mock me with its freedom, while I remained grounded in a reality that felt increasingly constricting. I knew deep down that I couldn't continue to live in this way. The tension between the life I had always known and the life I was beginning to desire was tearing me apart. Every time I allowed myself to think beyond the rules I had been taught, I felt a surge of something I hadn't known before. Hope. But it was always followed by a wave of fear. What would I lose if I followed this new path? What would happen to me if I chose freedom over duty? As I sat there under the stars, I realized something. I could not keep ignoring the growing sense inside me. I couldn't keep pretending that I was content with the life I had been living. Something was changing, and no matter how much I feared it, I knew I couldn't turn back now. The shift within me was too profound. The question was no longer if I could change, but whether I had the courage to face the consequences. My world began to crumble from the inside out. The questions that had been quietly echoing in my mind were now impossible to ignore, and they became more urgent with each passing day. I had always prided myself on being devout, someone who followed every rule, every tradition, with unquestioning obedience. But now, I found myself skipping prayers, avoiding the meetings with my friends, the very things that had once defined my existence. The weight of my fear was growing heavier, like an anchor pulling me deeper into uncertainty. It wasn't just the physical act of skipping prayers. It was the gnawing feeling that something was off inside me. My mind was in turmoil, and I couldn't explain it. I felt disconnected from everything I had known, like I was standing on the edge of a vast empty space, unable to move forward but also unable to turn back. The fear of the consequences, disownment, rejection, and the unbearable shame of abandoning everything my father had taught me, became increasingly real. It felt like I was suffocating under the pressure of these emotions, and yet I couldn't stop the pull of something different, something that I couldn't yet name. It was during these moments of isolation that I found myself turning to the Bible, secretly, when no one was watching. I knew it was forbidden, dangerous even, but the quiet whispers in my heart grew louder, urging me to seek answers outside of the teachings I had grown up with. I read in the dark, under the dim light of my room, allowing the words to wash over me, desperate for something that would make sense of the chaos in my mind. And one night, I came across a passage that hit me like a thunderbolt. Love does not fear. Those words echoed in my chest, vibrating through every fiber of my being. I couldn't understand why I had never heard such simple yet profound words before. Why was I living in fear? Why was I bound by rules that had only brought me anxiety and doubt? The concept of love being free from fear shattered everything I had been taught. My entire life had been steeped in fear of disobeying Allah, in fear of displeasing my father, in fear of being ostracized by my community. Fear had always been the force that governed my every move. Yet this love, this idea that love could exist without fear, was unlike anything I had known. I had been taught that faith was about discipline, about fearing Allah's wrath if I stepped out of line. But now I saw that love, true love, could offer something entirely different. As I continued to meet with Ferris in secret, his unwavering faith became even more apparent to me. He never pressured me or tried to convince me of anything. He simply lived out his beliefs with a kind of quiet certainty that made me question everything I had ever known. He spoke of love and forgiveness, and every word seemed to resonate with the longing I had kept buried deep inside me. The more I listened to him, the more I realized how much I had been missing. There was a peace in him, a peace that I could not find in my own life, no matter how hard I tried to follow the rules and rituals that had been drilled into me. Ferris never promised me answers, but the way he spoke of a love that was unconditional, that didn't demand perfection, made me feel something deep inside. I began to understand that my fear, my constant striving to please others and to follow the rules, was preventing me from experiencing that love. The more I reflected on it, the more I realized that I couldn't continue living the lie. I couldn't keep pretending to be someone I wasn't, someone who found peace in fear and obedience. I had to face the truth of who I was becoming, even if it meant losing everything. But as much as I knew that I could no longer live a lie, the resistance inside me was immense. The fear still held me tight, like a vice around my chest, squeezing out all the courage I tried to summon. I wasn't ready to let go of everything I had known, but the pull toward something else was undeniable. It was as if a battle raged inside me, each side vying for control, each side shouting louder than the last. The part of me that had always been obedient, that had always followed the rules, was desperate to hold on to the life I had known. But the part of me that was awakening, the part that longed for love and peace, refused to be silenced. I felt torn in half, like I was being pulled in two opposite directions, neither path offering comfort. The uncertainty, the fear of what would happen if I truly embraced this new understanding, was paralyzing. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I could not continue living in fear. If love could truly exist without fear, then I needed to find the courage to live that truth, no matter what it cost me. But for now, all I could do was sit with my uncertainty, wrestling with my own soul, not knowing which side would win. One night, in the dead of the night, my father entered my room. I had been reading the Bible, the very book I had been secretly hiding, trying to understand what it meant to live outside the boundaries I had been raised in. I wasn't expecting anyone to find me there, especially not him. But there he was, standing in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of me holding the book. The fury in his gaze was immediate and overwhelming. His face twisted with rage, and without saying a word, he ripped the Bible from my hands, throwing it violently to the floor. The sound of the pages hitting the ground felt like the shattering of everything I had ever known. "Traitor!" he shouted, his voice shaking with fury. "You are no son of mine." The words cut through me like a blade. I had always been my father's son, the obedient one, the one who followed every rule without question. But now, in his eyes, I was nothing. His voice, which had once spoken of love and guidance, now carried nothing but anger and contempt. I felt a deep emptiness spread inside me, something I had never experienced before. The love I had once felt from him was gone, replaced by a cold, unforgiving fury. In that moment, I realized the full weight of my actions. I had stepped beyond the point of no return. No matter how much I wished I could take back what I had done, no matter how badly I wanted to undo the decision I had made, I knew it was too late. The truth I had embraced, the path I had chosen, could never be erased. I had not only defied my father, but I had also turned my back on everything that had once defined my life. There was no coming back from this. The words of my father echoed in my ears, and I could feel my heart sinking deeper into a pit of guilt and fear. The next few days felt like a blur. I was locked in the basement, isolated from the world I had known. The cold stone walls closed in on me, and I couldn't escape the constant gnawing of regret that tore at my insides. I couldn't believe what had happened, and I couldn't forgive myself for the pain I had caused. Every part of me wanted to crawl back into the life I'd left behind, to beg for my father's forgiveness and return to the safety of the familiar. But deep down, I knew that I had made a choice that could not be undone. The fear of the consequences still gripped me, but I also knew that I had found something in my heart that could not be denied, no matter the cost. The silence in the basement was deafening. The darkness around me felt suffocating, and I could feel the weight of my decision pressing down on me. But then, in the middle of that overwhelming darkness, I heard a voice. It was soft, gentle, not the voice of my father or anyone I knew. It wasn't a voice that demanded. It didn't shout or condemn. It simply said, "You are not alone." The words were so simple, yet they pierced through the despair that had been clouding my mind. I didn't know where the voice came from or who it belonged to, but it filled me with an unexpected sense of calm. In that moment, I knew that I was being watched over, even in my deepest darkness. The voice didn't offer answers, didn't promise that everything would be okay, but it gave me something far more precious than any assurance. It gave me the strength to endure. The fear and guilt still haunted me, but in that moment, I felt a quiet certainty that I wasn't abandoned. I didn't know what the future held, and I didn't know if I would ever see my family again. But I knew that I couldn't give up. I had made my choice, and even though the consequences were far more than I could have ever imagined, I couldn't turn back now. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, I felt ready to face it, no matter where it led. As time passed, I began to feel something shift within me, something I couldn't explain, but it was profound. The days spent locked away in the basement, alone with my thoughts and fears, seemed endless, yet there was a quiet transformation taking place. The anger and shame that had clouded my mind slowly began to clear. I was beginning to experience a peace, a sense of calm that I had never known before. It wasn't the peace that I had always imagined faith to be, one that came from following strict rules and fearing punishment. No, this was different. This peace felt deeper, more real, more lasting. It was a peace that came not from fear, but from love. The days were long, but they were filled with a sense of stillness, a feeling that God wasn't watching from a distance, waiting to strike me down for my failings. Instead, I began to understand that God was present in the love and forgiveness I had been so afraid to accept. I realized that the God I had been taught about, the one I feared, was not the true God. The true God was in the grace, the mercy, and the love that I had learned about in my secret prayers. For the first time in my life, I understood that God wasn't found in the harsh discipline and the strict adherence to rules. He was found in the quiet moments of peace, in the forgiveness I had received, and the forgiveness I had to offer myself. Each time I prayed, it felt different. I no longer prayed out of duty, out of a sense of obligation or fear. The prayers I whispered now were full of gratitude, not because I was scared of hell or punishment, but because I was thankful to be alive, to have the chance to start again, to have the courage to walk a new path. I no longer saw prayer as a ritual. I saw it as a conversation, a dialogue with the divine that filled my heart with peace and clarity. It was no longer a prayer for protection from wrath, but a prayer of connection to something greater than myself. The more I prayed, the more I felt the weight of my past life lift. I didn't feel the need to be perfect anymore. I didn't feel like I had to prove myself to anyone, not even to my father. My heart felt lighter, as though I had been freed from a prison I had built around myself. In those moments of quiet prayer, I felt a love so pure, so unconditional, that it overwhelmed me. I began to see that this love was the true essence of faith, not the rigid rules and the fear of punishment I had been raised with. As my faith in Jesus grew stronger, I felt a strength within me that I had never known. It wasn't a strength that came from defiance or rebellion. It was a quiet strength, a certainty that no matter what happened, I was no longer alone. I was no longer afraid of the consequences of my choices. I had found something much greater than the fear that had once controlled me. I had found peace, I had found purpose, and I had found love. There were moments when I still doubted, moments when the old fears crept back in, threatening to drown me in their weight. But those moments were fewer and farther between. With each passing day, I felt more secure in my new faith, more confident in the love I had embraced. The words of the Bible, which had once felt foreign and dangerous, now felt like home. They resonated within me, echoing the quiet strength I was beginning to find in myself. I prayed not only for myself, but for those I had left behind, for the father I had once loved but now feared to face, for the life I had once known but could no longer return to. I prayed that they would find the peace I had found, the peace that came from knowing that love and grace were enough. I no longer believed in a God of punishment and fear. I believed in a God of love who accepted me for who I was, not for what I had done or failed to do. I wasn't sure where this path would lead me or what the future held, but for the first time in my life, I felt a deep, unshakable peace. I no longer felt lost. I had found my way. And as I continued to pray, to reflect, and to embrace this new understanding of God's love, I felt the strength to face whatever would come next. My heart was full, and for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. I had found a faith that wasn't about fear, but about freedom. And that, in itself, was the greatest gift I could have ever received. Several months had passed since that night in the basement, and I no longer hid my faith. The fear that had once consumed me was now replaced with a quiet confidence. I had learned to embrace the love I had found, and I no longer felt the need to keep it hidden. I began to speak openly about my belief in God, but it wasn't out of defiance or anger anymore. It was simply the truth I had come to understand, and I could no longer live in the shadows. The weight of secrecy that had once chained me was gone. When I saw my father again, the look in his eyes was different. There was a depth of sorrow there, a resignation that I'd never seen before. But I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel the need to apologize for the path I'd chosen. For the first time, I stood before him with a sense of peace, knowing that I was no longer trying to live up to expectations that were not my own. I could see the pain in his eyes, but it no longer held power over me. I understood that he was grieving, not just for the son he had lost, but for the faith he had hoped I would uphold. But I no longer feared his rejection. I had found something far more powerful than fear, the freedom to be myself, to live in truth, and to walk a path that felt right for me. Leaving my home was the hardest thing I had ever done. Walking away from the life I had known, from the family I loved, and from the place that had shaped me, felt like an act of tearing myself apart. But I also knew that staying would mean suffocating the person I had become. It was a choice I had to make. I knew I couldn't continue to live in fear of losing my father's approval or the love of a community that no longer understood me. I had to leave behind everything, my home, my family, the life I had known, and step into a future that was unknown, uncertain, and yet filled with possibility. As I walked away, I felt a deep sadness, but there was also a strange sense of freedom. For the first time in my life, I wasn't tethered to anything but my own heart. I had nothing left to prove, no more expectations to meet, no more fear to hold me back. I had lost much, but in that loss, I had found a strength I didn't know I possessed. I was no longer the frightened boy trying to live up to someone else's idea of who I should be. I was becoming someone new, someone who could stand on their own 2 feet, free from the chains of fear and guilt that had bound me for so long. In the months that followed, I began to help others who were searching for the same peace and love I had found. I met people who, like me, had felt lost and abandoned, people who were struggling with their own doubts, fears, and pain. I shared with them the story of my journey, of how I had come to understand the love of God in a way that transcended the fear I had once lived in. I didn't have all the answers, but I had found something worth sharing. A love that could heal, that could give peace, and that could set people free. I was no longer just a survivor of my past. I had become someone who was saved. I had found a new path, one that wasn't defined by the fears and limitations of the past. This new journey was not one of perfection, but of authenticity, of living in the truth of who I was. I didn't need to hide anymore. I had found the courage to embrace my faith and to walk the path of love and forgiveness, no matter where it led. This was my new path, and though it wasn't easy, it was the one I was meant to follow. In the quiet moments, when I thought back on everything I had left behind, I realized how much I had gained. I had gained the freedom to live as myself, without fear of judgment or rejection. I had found a community of people who shared the same values, who were also searching for peace and understanding. And most importantly, I had found peace within myself. I was no longer defined by my past mistakes, by the expectations of others, or by the fear of punishment. I was defined by the love I had come to understand, and it was this love that would guide me forward on this new path.